He increasingly came to Red Wing and spent time with his friend John Anderson, who was more than a patron. He was also a collaborator. John Anderson was, like his father, a scientist. He was also a good metal worker. He was also a very creative person and an artist. This is John Anderson, who eventually he and Biederman had a falling out, but their friendship was like the best kind of brotherhood at this time. Together, they created these constructions in 1940 for the Interstate Medical Clinic in Red Wing, Minnesota. This group of constructions has now been dispersed to various museums. The one right in front of us is at Carleton College. The one on the left is in the University of Minnesota Museum. This was a clinic that was founded by some of the doctors who founded the Mayo Clinic. This is for family practice. A family could sign up in toto. An array of experts would treat things as they were diagnosed through the general practitioner. Biederman and John Anderson designed the furniture, the color scheme, and they created these very avant-garde constructions. Imagine, one of the things that I've learned in this process is that rural Minnesota was a scientific hotbed of innovation, and that you might drive through there and see cornfields and cows, but there are a lot of intellectually dynamic and gifted people there. They also made this work. This was made in 1940. This was one of the constructions for the Interstate Medical Clinic, and it is colored neon. Neon had been invented a year before, but Anderson's father had set up laboratories in which scientific things went on regarding their agricultural investigations. And Anderson and Biederman had access to these laboratories, and they created this rather substantial work, which is made of glass and neon and wood. It's a very surprising Biederman that I didn't know before I started working on this. Biederman and Anderson spent the war doing medical experiments for the Army. It was a way that they were not drafted and sent to Europe. They studied asphyxiation and the effects of oxygen deprivation on pilots. They did experiments on prisoners in the local penitentiary and even on animals from the pound, which Biederman was very upset about, but it was wartime. By 1947, he was beginning to construct a new vocabulary. This is a construction from 1947, which employs, as you see, horizontals and verticals, the same kinds of constructed space, but the role of color now becomes ever more important. This is one of a handful of works that seem to have been spray painted, that were done with a spray gun. So you see the color kind of dispersing rather than sitting flat on the surface. It's a rather complicated work, and it's not there yet. He would later say that this was very much a period of transition. This is a later picture of Biederman's studio, in which you can see the various elements with which he made his work. The blue and yellow work in the upper right-hand corner is from the 1950s. The dark one in the middle is from the later 50s. The one on the left is from the 70s. And after 1947, he availed himself of a metal fabricating plant, also in Red Wing, that would stamp out elements that he could use and then paint and then drill into the back of colored planes. I was very interested in your discussion of the colored plane and the object sitting on top of it. And that, too, was one of Biederman's issues. Like, what do you do with this construction of colored planes? What was the inspiration for these compositions? Well, the inspiration very much was a small piece of land that his house sat on. It was he owned 3 acres of absolutely useless land that rose up from the plane of a riverbank, like a flying wedge. It was no good for agriculture. It was no good for really anything, but it was a it reminded me of the Chinese scholar painters who sit on a ledge in the middle of nowhere contemplating nature. And that's what Biederman did for many, many years. He looked at the structures of the bluffs and the cliffs and the light falling on things and the colors of the flowers and the colors of the light. And he made these constructions in emulation of them, much as Cézanne talked about his work as being parallel to nature. Biederman felt that modern artists who turn their back on nature made a great mistake, that we are all nature and everything that we understand comes from nature, and that to take nature out of the equation is not right. And for him, in many ways, his art turned backwards in order to go forwards. This is his wife, Mary. He married Mary Moore, who was the sister of that first friend at the Art Institute, and was also the sister of John Anderson's wife, Eugenie. And so Biederman then moved to Minnesota in 1941, and they settled down there. And Mary Moore, Biederman, became his helpmate and his editor. She read German and French. She helped him on his book. And she believed in him and his work even when things were very dire and very difficult. This is sort of out of place, but this is a photograph of Korzybski, with whom Biederman had off and on encounters all the way up through the early 1940s. They bought this house in 1954, just after a very important event of 1953. John Anderson terminated his support of Biederman in 1953, and Biederman was penniless and had no other means of support. Mary went back to school, earned her teaching degree, and supported them for 11 years. And they lived in this house, which you can see is painted a la Biederman. Biederman's later work is a very fine evolution out of the early work. This is a painting or a work called from 1979, and it is as you can see, the planes advance in real space. The colors influence one another. When the light hits a certain way, the green will reflect on the blue. The shadows will highlight or diminish the things in back of them. Jan van der Mark, the very marvelous writer and curator, called these landscapes by whatever name when he wrote his catalog on Biederman in 1954. In 1959, Biederman had been corresponding with artists in Britain, artists like Victor Pasmore, Anthony Hill, Mary Martin. And in 1959, there was the very famous This Is Tomorrow exhibition in London. And most of us have read about it, about the debut of pop art. But one of the exhibitions within the This Is Tomorrow was an exhibition of British modernism. Many of those artists had read Biederman's book, The Art is the Evolution of Visual Knowledge, and they began a relationship with him. In that exhibition was a wall with reproductions of Biederman's work and a statement by those artists saying, he is one of our own. This at a time when Biederman was absolutely unknown in his own country, where he had no sales, no support, and in fact people in his own community thought that he was an eccentric and washed up person. In 1960, he began correspondence with the British physicist David Bohm, who some of you may know of. David Bohm was one of the innovators of quantum physics and worked with Einstein on the Manhattan Project. He was also something of an intellectual rebel.